Thanks for having me this evening. Our office is about 15, 20 metres just up Devonshire Street. And of course, one can see the South East Light Rail being built. We of course knew it was going to come up because over a year ago we became aware that the large, healthy, mature Moreton Bay figs along Allison Road and Allison Road were going to be chopped down for the light rail. And that really did spark the renewed push to protect tree canopy and open spaces in Sydney. And at the time, it was December, we described it as an urban tree massacre, which of course is has only expanded across Sydney. And of course, they knocked down some trees in Devonshire Street, much to the dismay of people who love Devonshire Street and people who live in Surrey Hills. And we know how important those trees are. In fact, I guess sometimes I get a bit blasé, you know, you're sort of fighting here and there and doing campaigns and writing press releases and managing human resource problems in TEC, as one has to at times. But after seeing those Moreton Bay figs being chopped down, you know, even Jaundice Jeff would look at a tree differently and say, my God, those things are really important to Sydney. And they actually had real character and real value for people, whether they were walking under them as tourists or in fact whether they lived next to them or near them or walked under them for all their lives. So those trees are definitive pieces of environmental resources for our city. Sydney, of course, has had a very long history of fighting for trees and open spaces. In the 1800s, early 1900s, people would fight to keep the Sydney Harbour foreshores in public ownership. And throughout that period, as we had some of the early conservationists in the 1920s and 30s and 50s, they too would be fighting to protect urban bushland. And in response to their efforts, they've left a legacy of some quite good green corridors. The Cumberland County Plan in the late 40s promised that Sydney would have a green grid, a whole set of green corridors separating suburbs and keeping a balance in the city's landscape. But of course we know what happened to that as Sydney grew. And that's been the history of Sydney. Every time we've gone through a major growth phase, like the one we're now experiencing, more trees go, more urban open spaces are alienated and built on. From the establishment of TEC in 1972, almost on day one, we were fighting to protect urban open spaces with local community groups. And as that repetitive growth spurt occurred in Sydney, we would again and again have to try and protect those open spaces. We had some successes. Some of the great parks, particularly urban bushland parks that we now have, are a testimony to the community campaigning of those earlier years in the 70s and 80s. There was also a very big push to alienate for lease or license open spaces so that a council could virtually sell off a local park to an exclusive use. And we were successful with then Local Government Minister Ernie Page in amending the Local Government Act so that they could no longer secretly sell off for commercial purposes local parks, and they had to engage in a much more consultative and transparent process. And that, to some extent, stalled the alienation of green spaces. But of course, one of the things that you can't stop developers doing, whether they're public or private, is saying that that open space is worth nothing, I can get it for my development and make myself more profitable. And we're now facing that type of enlarged risk today. The SOS Green Spaces campaign has only emerged, as I said, as we saw those Moreton Bay figs being clear-felled and wood-chipped after midnight. And as we started to talk to a whole range of community groups and were contacted by them, we assembled a map of what we're calling the SOS Green Spaces Battle Map. And after a few months, we ended up with over 70 areas. I mean, anyone would call that a crisis in green space protection. Those 70 areas comprise a range and a scale of different scales of threats and areas under danger. Some would be local issues, small local parks. For example, Bankstown Council had a proposal before it to sell off 16 local parks. Some of the areas would be bigger, like, of course, the attacks by Westconnex. Other areas would be proposals to convert from community land, which has some quite strict management principles attached to it, to operational land, which then allows a council to sell it. There have been additional threats that have developed with new legislation coming through, mainly fostered by the Department of Planning. I'm sure you all love the Department of Planning. Yes. This department actually describes itself as an economic decision-making department. It actually doesn't think it's a balanced exercise, social, environmental and economic. It says we make economic decisions to continue Sydney's growth. That the department is sponsoring a range of exempt and complying state environmental planning policies, which in terms of private open space, that is areas with backyards and with mature trees in them, is able to intensively develop them. I mean, I'm not necessarily opposed to some degree of increased density, but if at the same time you are removing private open space, increasing density, and the existing public open space is inadequate, you really are creating a disaster of livability. One of the things that has become more important in the armoury of our arguments is that there is a much greater appreciation growing, not just about it's nice to have a park or we should protect that wildlife habitat, but there is now increasing objective scientific and medical evidence that having a green space next to you actually facilitates a healthier lifestyle, so that people who live near green spaces are more likely to go walking and engage in healthy exercise. In addition, we are seeing, partly exaggerated by climate change, the urban heat island. And the fact is that more people die in Sydney from the effects of urban heat in the sort of hot, very hot summer temperatures we're now getting, and the lack of a tree canopy, nature's air conditioner, like those big Moreton Bay figs were able to establish, creates an unhealthy environment for people. Additionally, of course, they have to invest and pay more for air conditioning. So the armoury of information that we have to defend green open spaces has increased, and we're now finding that it's not just local community groups or local urban bushland protection groups that are seeking to protect these areas, but wider groups of people, whether it's in the health sector, the sport and recreation sector. Sydney at the moment is reaching a crisis point. So one of the things we think about at TEC is what other leverage points we can use in order to improve the prospects for improved green space protection. So there are three things happening. One, of course, is the very strong community campaign that is developing around SOS green spaces. Dozens and dozens of groups speaking with one voice and speaking louder. Secondly, we have the Greater Sydney Commission, which, certainly compared to the Department of Planning, is putting up there, top of the agenda, the green grid. They are actually talking about a system of connected parks across Sydney, a bit of an echo of the County of Cumberland plan, but the culture of the Greater Sydney Commission is vastly different to that of the Department of Planning, which would never have been so ambitious to talk about that. Now, I'm not saying we're actually going to get a green grid. There's lots of work to do still, but they've certainly put it not only on the public agenda, but the political agenda. Thirdly, the Greater Sydney Commission and health experts are talking more and more about urban heat. And that too is being elevated as an issue in the planning of Sydney. The Greater Sydney Commission is also doing the new metro strategy. And in the hierarchy of planning that Sydney will be subjected to, we'll have the metro strategy, which they're now working on this year. Then we'll have the district plans, which the GSC is also working on, and then local councils will come in, apparently developing more of the detailed planning and precinct provisions. But I hope you would agree that somewhere in that system we need some very clear directives about protecting green spaces and protecting the tree canopy. And to some extent, leaving it to council by council is not going to achieve that metro scale improvement we need. Now, of course, there is internal opposition in government, including probably from the Department of Planning, who are somewhat jealous that a lot of their powers have been transferred to the GSC. And it's very important that the apparently good things that are happening out of the Greater Sydney Commission, we are able to leverage, because the Greater Sydney Commission is, not all powerful inside government and at the level of the cabinet table. So they're helping to some extent, but it's certainly the community campaign that's absolutely crucial in keeping those things at the top of the agenda. We're seeking quite important systemic changes to how green spaces and tree canopies are treated in Sydney and other similar metro areas. One of the things that TEC attempts to do is that when we see there are lots of, let's call them spot fires breaking out, that is evidence of a systemic problem in the planning system. And we therefore try to develop systemic solutions. We have 4 types of systemic changes that we're pushing for. The first is that when planning decisions are made, whether they're state significant development or regional scale development or local development, that the open spaces, private and public, and the mature tree canopy are actually measured for their real value. There are a range of studies, evaluations that have been undertaken in London and Melbourne, Los Angeles, and when they look at the value of the trees in the parks, they come up with hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, I've yet to see a metro strategy, let alone a major development precinct strategy, say that if we remove those trees and parks, hundreds of millions of dollars of economic value for those environmental services is going to be lost. So as the first step, we are trying to elevate the economic expression of how important those areas are. That, of course, has a sort of compensating measure that if anyone wants to take those things away, they'd better hand over several $100 million. Creates a bit of a barrier to taking those areas away. Secondly, we're seeking to have important parks, important tree canopies totally off limits. What's basically called the red light approach that we used to have in land clearing laws, but the current government's now getting rid of. But there are basically areas you can't touch. And as associated with that a lot of these areas need parliamentary approval to be removed. They're actually being gazetted as permanent features of Sydney, which are extremely difficult to move, to get rid of. So we're trying to elevate the legislative protection of these areas. Thirdly, we want the Greater Sydney Commission to start setting targets for more tree canopy in the areas of Sydney, particularly out west, where the urban heat island is having absolutely devastating impact on the environment and on people's health. And when you talk to people who live out in Western Sydney, it can be something like 10 degrees hotter than here, and that's just not healthy. Fourthly, we want the combination of those factors to elevate the importance of green space and tree canopies in the decision making. It is to some credit that Rob Stokes, when he set up the Greater Sydney Commission, created an Environment Commissioner, Economic Commissioner and a Social Commissioner. People who didn't come from the traditional planning culture from the department, and that's attempt at triple bottom line, ecologically sustainable development if you like, is absolutely important in the conversation at the upper echelons of government. So we're trying to create a far more balanced decision-making process in regard to tree canopies and urban green space, and recognising that many areas are inadequate in the provisions of trees and green space, setting mandatory targets on councils and other authorities to increase the amount. Excuse me. So that's where the campaign is at the moment. We're finding quite reasonable response from Labor and Liberal and of course Green MPs. They're starting to bring up the issue inside Parliament. I think we're seeing the media understand the importance of these areas, and each of the latest episode of an attack on a park, whether it's in Western Sydney or Strathfield or Cook's Cove down at Arncliffe, the top of the F6 corridor, which is an absolutely amazing place. I mean, the history, including the Aboriginal war history against Europeans, the history and what's left along that corridor, which admittedly is there because they were going to propose a major road, and that is probably the next big road they want to build, hopefully not on the surface. or in fact below the surface, because we don't need any more roads in Sydney of that size, would just be a massive loss to the southwest of Sydney. GSC says they should keep it. So, what do I take from all that? We have a very energetic campaign. We have had a number of meetings with community groups, including a major forum a few months ago, and people weren't burnt out. They were there wanting to fight. And I think that is a reflection, you know, almost an historical echo of what Sydney, each generation does every time Sydney goes through these serious growth phases. Finally, I think that a government that doesn't look after green spaces and trees, like a government that tries to build the Westconnex, doesn't care about people. And that's what is not, it's not only an environmental battle, it's about a government showing it cares about people. And clearly the types of things that they've been doing to build the Westconnex shows they don't care about people, let alone the environment. Thank you.